Hello and welcome to No Holding Back with me, Susan Estrich. Each week I'll have the privilege of talking with some of the biggest names from the worlds of media, politics, and law. Nothing is off the table. I'll be speaking my mind and encouraging my guests to do so too. Today we're honored to have an exceptional guest with us, Richard Haass. Richard is a distinguished diplomat, esteemed author, and the former president of the Council on Foreign Relations, position he held for 20 years. With his career that spans over 4 decades, Richard has been instrumental in shaping U.S. foreign policy and global democracy. He served as Director of Policy Planning for the U.S. Secretary of State under Colin Powell during the George W. Bush administration, provided strategic guidance, and helped navigate the complexities of international relations in the post 9/11 world. Additionally, he was a key advisor to President George H.W. Bush during the Gulf War, where his expertise was crucial in managing one of the most significant military and diplomatic efforts of the late 20th century. Today, we hope that Richard can straighten out for us what's going on in Israel, what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on all over the world. Richard, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Although you just gave me a standard of success I doubt I could beat, but I look forward to it.
Well, I think you have beaten it over the last 4 decades. So I'm hoping you can straighten out for me. I'm completely confused about what's going on with these peace initiatives in the Middle East, what's going on with Israel, which says it won't agree to a ceasefire unless Hamas is destroyed, what's going on with Hamas, which is saying that it will only agree to a permanent ceasefire and doesn't want to be destroyed. What's the prospect in Israel right now, and what's going on in your judgment?
Well, even by Middle Eastern standards, Susan, it's been a bizarre week or two. The end of May, I think it was May 31st, President Biden went out and made this statement announcing essentially that a ceasefire had been wired, this 3-phase deal, and so forth, based on an Israeli proposal. And no sooner does he come out with it that the Israelis essentially back off from it. Hamas never signs on to it. And I think what it suggests is that there's still a pretty significant gap between those two entities, between Israel and Hamas. And if I were a betting man, I would think this conflict there goes on for some time. The Israeli National Security Advisor said the military operation needs to continue through the end of the calendar year. I don't think it'll continue at a high or heavy level, but I think at a lower level, I think we can expect Israel to continue military operations against Hamas units, individuals, the leadership, if they get a chance. And Hamas is going to continue to say they'll only accept a ceasefire if it's permanent and if the Israelis completely leave Gaza, which Israel isn't prepared to do.
So is it a hopeless situation? What was going on with President Biden? I mean, he put himself out in the line there. It looked like he had a deal, and then the deal fell apart as soon as he put himself out in the line. What's going on?
It's a good question, and I don't have an authoritative answer on that. It's confusing because I thought it was teed up. I thought it was wired, to use a word that those of us who have served in government would use quite commonly, and it clearly wasn't. So either the Israelis changed their mind, and that's possible, that he had certain indications that the Israeli government was prepared to sign on to this deal, which, by the way, they helped develop. Then there were splits within the Israeli government. The far right ministers wanted no part of it and threatened to bring down the government. So I don't know if the administration got too far forward on its skis. There was a miscommunication with Israel. The Israelis changed their mind, some combination of the above. But again, here we are a week later, essentially, and things don't seem to be coming together. They're even worse. And at the risk of getting ahead of ourselves, the war clouds or drums or whatever word you want to use, whatever metaphor, seem to be growing vis-a-vis the north between Israel and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. So it's not far-fetched to say over the next few months, we'll see continued low-level fighting in Gaza, and we will see potentially more intense fighting in the north between Israel and Hezbollah.
Can Israel wage a two-front war?
Well, I think one of the views is that they would wind down, not completely, but to a considerable degree, the intensity of the war in Gaza. Essentially, they've run out pretty much of large military or concentrated targets. So I think they've naturally reached that point. They've got an open-ended situation, though, because they have to deal with any reconstitution of Hamas. They've got to deal with the thousands of individuals who they haven't been able to get. So I think they continue a low-level, open-ended operation in Gaza, which would not preclude a larger operation, a more traditional military operation in the north.
President Biden said that Hamas is no longer in a position where it could carry out a terrorist attack like it did on October 7th. Is that right? What does he mean by that?
I think it's 100% true. And the only reason they were able to carry it out on October 7th is because of the failure of Israeli intelligence and the military. But Israel has presumably learned a few lessons from that. They've reconstituted some of their intelligence capabilities and defense. And Hamas doesn't have that number of forces they could throw at it. They're very much on the defense. They've lost the element of surprise. So they can carry out the odd attack. And we saw that a few days ago where they shot off a few missiles. But the idea of doing anything remotely on the scale of October 7th, no. I just don't see that at all being feasible.
So is Israel in a position where it has, quote, destroyed Hamas, or is that a goal that is not realistic in the first instance?
It's not realistic in the first instance. What Israel has done is significantly degraded Hamas. Hamas no longer poses the sort of threat, going back to what you were just saying, that they could on October 7th, but it continues to be a low-level threat as is. And the flaw in the ointment is it could reconstitute itself and become a bigger threat than it currently is. And that then brings us to the larger conversation that if Israel doesn't want to occupy Gaza, what is going to be there that would prevent Hamas from reconstituting? And the only idea I've heard of that has some validity is that you would have some Arab force with a significant Palestinian component, but the Israelis won't sign off on the idea of a significant Palestinian component, and the Arabs won't sign off on the idea unless there is a significant Palestinian component, as well as an Israeli political initiative that would satisfy at least some of the Palestinians' political aspirations. So we're at something of a gridlock there, because the various parties can't come together on what would be the terms of reference for neither Hamas nor Israel to provide security and governance in Gaza.
What does a significant Palestinian presence mean? What does that mean in English?
What it would mean militarily is you'd have to have several thousand police or soldiers affiliated with the Palestinian Authority. And you'd also want to have some type of civilian presence in terms of economic governance, in terms of distribution of aid, and so forth, to preside over Gaza. Again, the alternative is Hamas you don't want to have, needless to say. And Israel has done the occupation of Gaza. It did it, roughly 20 years ago. It's learned the hard way that occupations over time become more costly and less effective. So again, I don't see any alternative to the Palestinian Authority. And having said that, let me be the first to acknowledge that the Palestinian Authority is a deeply flawed organization. It's got limited capabilities. It has a history of corruption, and it essentially was politically and militarily defeated in Gaza two decades ago. So it can only come back with significant help from the United States and from Arab countries.
And what about the Arab countries? Are they willing to get back in there?
They're uneasy about it. And I'd say, based on my conversations with several of the governments, it's heavily conditional. They'd only be prepared to get back if it looked like, well, let me put it in the negative, they're not prepared to get back in a situation where it looked like they were doing the bidding or the work of an Israeli occupation. So they want to get back under a chapeau, under some type of a cover that things are moving in the direction of meeting, if not all, at least some Palestinian political aspirations. That again means Israel has to talk about either a Palestinian state or significant progress in that direction. Otherwise, the Arab countries won't get involved either politically or militarily or economically. I also think there's another complication. If I'm right, and you still have, for example, several thousand Hamas fighters who remain in Gaza, and I think you have to assume one does, that, well, when people talk about a force in Gaza, and they often talk about a peacekeeping force, I think it's actually much more demanding than that. I actually would say it's something of a peacemaking force. They have to expect to encounter resistance from Hamas. So they're going to need to be militarily capable and prepared to take casualties.
And who's that going to be? Is that going to be an Arab force, an Israeli force? What is it going to be?
I don't believe it can be an Israeli force because that's occupation. I think it would have to be an Arab force. Probably countries like Egypt would play a significant role, possibly the Saudis, if they get the political understandings they want, possibly the UAE, possibly Jordan could have a role. I think the United States would have to be involved, perhaps in a command structure, certainly with the provision of intelligence, conceivably lift. So I think it would be a true multinational effort. And by the way, again, you'd have to have a significant Palestinian component. Over time, you could possibly even build a Gazan component. But I don't want to underestimate how difficult this will be to pull off.
It sounds impossible. Am I wrong?
Sounds difficult, you're right.
And who's going to pull this off? Is Joe Biden going to pull this off? Is Donald Trump going to pull this off? How is this going to get pulled off?
It's not going to happen without the United States doing a heavy lift. Diplomatically, we're going to have to cobble this together. We're going to have to lean on the Israelis to get what we want politically and diplomatically. We'll have to lean on the Arabs to get what we want militarily and economically. Again, I think we'll have to be a part of it in terms of providing command and intelligence and other facilitation. But look, this is going to be difficult. But the only two alternatives, again, are Israeli. Well, probably three alternatives. None is pleasant. One would be a kind of growing gang-like situation where Gaza really centralized order breaks down, and it takes on elements of what we've seen in some other Arab countries. We don't want to see that. You don't want to see Hamas reconstitute to a significant degree, and we don't want to have an Israeli occupation. That's not a sustainable choice. So as difficult as this is to get from here to there, I don't think there's a viable alternative. So my view is let's get serious about it.
And what does getting serious mean, Richard? Who has to get serious? I mean, Biden made it sound easy last week, and then it became impossible. How do you get serious about it?
Well, I would say the United States has to push for it, and if in the absence of our succeeding, then what you're going to look at is Israeli occupation. And my guess is if you end up going that way for a while, Susan, which is quite possible, that becomes a kind of default position. Occupation will be expensive for the Israelis. It'll be expensive diplomatically. It'll be expensive in military terms. It'll be expensive in physical and human terms. So I think sooner or later, people will realize that there's no alternative to something like this. People may not be ready to make that decision now. I get it. But we will get to that point. I'm not smart enough to say it'll take days, weeks, months, or years, but we will get to the point where you're going to need some sort of a U.S. Arab type, including Palestinian presence for governing and for military security in order to create, among other things, an environment where people can go home, where reconstruction can begin. But I do think that's inevitable, but it may not be immediately possible. I hear what you're saying.
Where does Netanyahu fit in all this? Is he one of the people who's got to get there? Is Benny Gantz with his June 8th ultimatum going to push in that direction? Where's the leadership coming from in Israel?
Well, at the moment, it's not really coming from anywhere. Benny Gantz, I don't think, has enough horses, if you will, politically, in order to put a lot of pressure on the government. The prime minister, Bibi Netanyahu, continues to hold the initiative. His problem is that he's got elements of his government that won't go along with this, that they are not willing, how would I put it, to pay the political price, as they would see it, that would be required to get this going, because they're not interested in setting up anything that could ever lead to a Palestinian state in Gaza or the West Bank. So they're not willing to lay out a political horizon that the Arab countries or the Palestinians require to do this. So Bibi Netanyahu either has to stay where he is, in which case he keeps delaying and is unwilling to do anything decisive. And that would bring us to where I mentioned a few minutes ago. That would mean an open-ended, low-level war in Gaza, and potentially turning more of his attention to the north. Or at some point, he may decide he can go to new elections and put together a different coalition. But he can't get there with his current coalition. And I think the prime minister is still in the driver's seat. Whatever his limitations or flaws are, he's by far the most capable Israeli politician on the scene.
And explain to me, if you can, how Israeli elections work, because I have never quite understood this. When does he have to face the voters?
Well, if my memory is correct, he has until 2026 in order to face the voters in terms of the tenure of this government. But the government could change two ways. You could have a reshuffling of coalitions within the current parliament, or you could have this government brought down and new elections could be forced. So those are the only options. Right now, he has, I think it's a 4-seat majority in the Knesset. Gives him a little bit of cushion. Nobody else at the moment has a viable alternative. But my guess is he will probably avoid doing anything to bring down his current coalition, unless he believes he can do so, how would I call it, safely in the political sense, that his numbers are such in the polls, the issues are such that he believes he could go back to the Israeli voters, would not be held accountable, for example, for October 7th, to the extent that he couldn't prevail in election. And the polls are moving in his direction. Recently, his numbers have gone up. And so I don't rule that out. And again, what I don't know, if you have a new kind of status quo in Gaza, and there is something of an intense war in the north, that'll change the political conversation. Who knows where things will be then in a couple of months or in 6 months. So I'm not confident saying how this plays out, but a lot of people who are no fans of the prime minister, I think, have been too quick to assume that somehow he can't survive politically. And so far, he's proven them all wrong.
How does Biden survive this politically?
It hurts him. I think the president now, after 8 months, has allowed an enormous gap to develop between his rhetoric and what's happening. The president's put a lot of weight on what I would call a foreign policy of persuasion to bring the Israelis around, either in how they use military force or whether they use military force or what they do diplomatically. And I don't believe he has much to show for 8 months of persuasion. And it's put him, I think, in a truly unattractive situation where, again, people notice the gap. And when he ends up, and every once in a while, he tries to put a little bit of pressure on the Israelis for a while, not allowing the 2,000-pound munitions to go, doing this or that in the UN. So he ends up doing enough that's critical of Israel to alienate some of Israel's supporters, but not nearly enough to satisfy Israel's growing number of critics in the United States. So this seems to me, it's one of those halfway houses where, rather than being a compromise that wins the conversation, the president seems to me to be caught in a way that satisfies nobody. And then what happened a week ago or so, when he came out on May 31st, that was just odd, because he seemed to be claiming victory or major progress when, as we've seen, It never materialized. So it adds to the sense that whatever his intentions, whatever, he's just not performing in a way here that he's not been able to narrow the gap between what he wants and what he can bring about.
What should he do?
Well, what I have been arguing now for, I guess, about 7.5 months is he ought to have a more independent policy in the United Nations. The United States ought to be advocating for what it wants. We ought to be willing to hold off certain weapon systems if we think they're being used incorrectly. We ought to put much more pressure on Israel in terms of its settlement activity. We ought to, for example, require that anything produced in settlements that's exported to the United States should not say made in Israel, but should say made in the occupied territories. We ought to have more sanctions against settlers who are using violence to terrorize or intimidate Palestinians. And what he did the other day, I actually like. He should just do more of it. I think he should take the conversation to the Israeli people. This Israeli government is unwilling, I believe, to talk to the Israeli people about their real choices and the consequences. That's something the President of the United States has to do. I actually said at one point that he should take a page out of Bibi Netanyahu's book, go to Israel and speak to the Knesset and go over the head of the government and try to frame the issue for the Israeli people in a way that would hopefully have some resonance. But if I had to add it all up, and I've neglected to mention the thing, our attempts to get more aid into Gaza through the airdrops and then the pier that didn't work out very well. But we ought to have a more independent policy, not put so many of our eggs in the basket of trying to persuade this Israeli government. But we can try to persuade them. But if and when it becomes obvious persuasion is not going to work, then we ought to go say and do what we think is right and necessary.
And what do you think Trump would do differently?
It's a great question. My guess is he'd potentially be less involved. I think he'd leave more up to the Israelis. If one looked at the past, he was willing to let this, the previous, still under Bibi Netanyahu, the Israeli government determine more of what it wanted. The Palestinians were never a priority for Donald Trump. The whole construct of the Abraham Accords essentially ignored the Palestinians. But if he inherited this situation, my guess is he'd give the Israeli government a lot of running room. And what worries me then is where that leads, because I worry about future settlement activity. I worry about an Israel that gets overextended militarily. I worry about an Israel that gets more isolated from the American people or from its traditional basis of support in Europe. And at the end of the day, I want Israel to remain not just a secure and prosperous country, but I also want it to remain a Jewish and democratic country. And being Jewish and democratic is incompatible with open-ended occupation. Something has to give. Either the Palestinians are second class, in which case Israel ceases to be a democracy, or the Palestinians have equal rights, in which case Israel ceases to be a Jewish state. So I continue to believe that Israel needs a Palestinian state. We can talk about the conditions and the limits, about militarization and the rest. Territory would have to be negotiated. But I really believe that Israel needs a Palestinian state, not simply as a favor to the Palestinians or for any moral reason. I think it needs it out of self-interest. That's the only way I know to create a basis for long-term Israeli success, both at home and in its international relationships. And I think the United States ought to, be regularly pounding that drum.
Sounds like you're closer to the Biden administration than to the Trump administration. Is that a fair reading?
I've had disagreements with both on this issue, and look, the situation's gotten worse. I thought the Trump administration got it badly wrong. Not that I was against the Abraham Accords and what they accomplished, but I was very critical of them and what they ignored. And when it came to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, there was no pressure on Israel not to do certain things. And the Biden administration, it didn't cause this crisis. It obviously was caused by Hamas. Then you had the Israeli response to it, but I don't think the administration has found its footing. Look, it's a difficult foreign policy challenge. Let me just acknowledge that, Susan. It's difficult to deal with our adversaries. At times, it's even more difficult to deal with our friends. And what do you do
Yeah.
when you're not on the same page as a friend? How do you preserve a friendship in the context of disagreement? And that's where President Biden finds himself. He's been a long-term stalwart supporter of Israel, and I don't think he's figured it out how to how to disagree with a close friend and ally, and that's why you get a lot of these halfway measures and the toing and froing. So I'm uncomfortable with where the Biden administration has ended up, and I was uncomfortable with where the Trump administration was, and I expect I'd be uncomfortable with where it would end up if it were to be, returned to office.
Ukraine. I know you have a hard stop in a few minutes, but tell me what you think is going to happen in Ukraine. I mean, Donald Trump said he'd just get Zelensky and Putin in the room together and muscle this through. That doesn't seem like it's a very realistic solution. What's going to happen there?
Well, I think, for this year, now that the U.S. aid has been restored and we've taken off some of the restraints on how Ukraine can use some of the U.S. supplied weapon systems, my guess is nothing decisive happens for this third fighting season. And so then you have the U.S. election. And then the question is what happens then? And there's issues of does U.S. aid get restored or a new tranche of it get green lit? Does that happen? And I think at some point does the behavior of either Ukraine or Russia changes? And let me suggest two ways. In terms of Russia, at any point does Mr. Putin begin to feel the pain of the war? The sanctions, the cumulative effect, not so much, but militarily, the costs of trying to advance are great, the human and military costs. And if Ukraine, as I hope it will, starts attacking Russian forces and sites within Russia, then it brings the costs of the war to Putin. So ideally, you'll have a situation over the next year where Russia's not advancing, but it's paying a high price and a higher price for the day in, day out of the war. So I'm hoping that happens. And at some point, Ukraine has to get realistic. I simply do not believe Ukraine is going to be able to recover Crimea or most of the areas in the east through military means. I just don't think it's going to be able to militarily liberate these areas. So I think the best we can get for the foreseeable future is some type of a temporary or interim ceasefire, call it an armistice. Both sides would be allowed to rearm. Neither side would have to give up its long-term goals or dreams. But I think that's conceivable. But it would take, again, a kind of realism to settle in on both Ukraine and Russia, that they can achieve their goals through military means. The costs of trying to do so are great. So I think I don't know how that strikes you, but I think that's conceivable in 2025 or 2026. But that would mean that the United States would have to be willing to stand by Ukraine enough so that Russia could not prevail. But also, we'd have to have a very honest conversation with Ukraine about that it can't define success in terms of military liberation. That's simply not going to happen. It's not achievable. It's not that it's not desirable, it's not achievable. So, I don't, whether we can pull that off, I can describe it as I just did. Whether we can pull that off in day to day, I don't know, but that's going to be the choice, I think, in front of either President Biden or President Trump.
The world is a very complicated place, and it strikes me that what I'm hearing from you is that we have two wars that are going to keep going on. Is that fair to say?
I think that peace in either case is not going to happen. And by peace, I mean anything formal, consensual, battleship Missouri treaties and all that ain't going to happen. I think in Ukraine, the best you can hope for in the next couple of years is some sort of, again, temporary, hopefully prolonged ceasefire, probably along the current territorial lines that at least stops a lot of the dying and allows the economic rebuilding to begin. I think that is as crazy as it sounds. I think that is optimistic, but at least imaginable. I think for Israelis and Palestinians, you need to have a change of heart in Israel. And then I think you could set in motion a political process where you could bring the war to an end in Gaza, get the hostages who are still alive back, begin a process of reconstituting Gaza, under some type of Arab Palestinian Authority, and then you'd have to begin a political process also in the West Bank. It's not peace, but at least it wouldn't be war, and it would hold out the possibility of something down the road. But that's about as optimistic as I can get, which may not sound to be terribly optimistic, but in places like Ukraine and the Middle East, it's not bad compared to what we've seen.
You are really the expert on this, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate your insight. You've been listening to No Holding Back with me, Susan Estrich. Thank you to Richard Haass for a great conversation. Tweet us at No Holding Back FM, and if you enjoyed this episode, please share the link on social media. You can sign up to receive an email when a new episode drops at our website, noholdingback.fm. Thank you for listening, and thank you again to Richard Haass for a brilliant conversation.